The title, Screenwriting is Filmmaking. Tricksy title. If you go on to Amazon, you'll find there are over 3,000 books on screenwriting. I had no idea. Does the world need another book on screenwriting? Of course they do. They need my book. In order to rise above the pack, you've got to have a clever title, but the title goes right to the heart of the book and goes right to the heart of my experience. I began as a writer in radio, and actually radio has a lot in common with cinema. But I knew nothing about writing for the screen, and I got into a film school in London, working up in Edinburgh at the time. I came south, not knowing anything about how to write for the screen. And the first exercise we did at the film school was, there was 20 of us, broken down into 4 groups of 5, and each group were given the same script. So we made 4 films from the same script, and each day we had a different role. One day we were operating the camera, the next day we were lighting, the next day we were directing, the next day we did sound. And there was a professional practitioner on hand to instruct us on how to work all of these different devices. And at the end of the shoot, each of us edited a section of the film, and then we saw the 4 different films. And there in 1 week, I kind of got it. Writing for the screen is not just writing, you have to understand something about the way in which film creates meaning through sound and image, through juxtaposition, and particularly through editing. It's said that the film is made 3 times. Once when the writer kind of beats out the structure in the screenplay. The second time when the director brings in the actors and starts to work with them and discovers that what seemed quite plausible on the page is not necessary, because that look between the actors says as much as 2 pages of dialogue. So the director is already reworking and reimagining and reinventing with all the apparatus of film at his disposal, the lights and the framing and the choreographing of the actor before the camera and the movement. And this is the magic of cinema, and understanding uniquely how, a character standing by a tree as the wind blows through the forest creates a very unique feeling in the mind of the audience and in the feelings of the audience, is to understand that cinema creates something quite unique. It's an art form in its own right. And understanding that, and understanding something of the technicalities of how film creates meaning, will make you a better screenwriter. That's the implication of the title, Screenwriting is Filmmaking. In writing a screenplay, imaginatively, you are not just a writer, you are an actor. You are all the characters, as you would be if you're writing fiction. But you're also the director. You're deciding how close and far and when to cut between them. You're also the photographer. You're framing the action. And you're also, crucially, the editor. If there's one useful technical skill for a screenwriter to have, is to try and get into, it would be editing, to get into the cutting room and to see how the film gets reimagined and recreated and rewritten in the cutting room by moving this scene from here to there, by dropping that scene, by cutting from here to there, and so on, by changing the rhythm of the whole, and therefore the meaning of the whole piece. He understands how he is also an editor. He's a filmmaker. Discovering what you want to say, of course, like any kind of fictional writing. What moves and interests you? That's the starting point. You're searching for a dramatic premise or a problem that you want to explore. You're working from the inside out. You're not imposing a structure on the material. But how to structure is something that you study. How to structure your material for an audience, how to engage an audience, how to keep an audience involved is what the structural principles are about. So understanding something about narrative and dramatic principles, as well as the craft skills involved, will help make you a better screenwriter. And that's what the book is crucially involved with, as well as talking about these things within the context of the distinctive language of cinema. So what are these narrative principles, and what are the key ones? I mean, cinema is both narrative and dramatic, in the sense that narrative or storytelling is precisely that. It's about telling a story. But cinema does it through showing. It's a telling through showing. So hence you get the kind of workshop cliche, show, don't tell. Right? Come back to that in a second. The structuring of your material is, we already know, some of the basic principles. They're at our fingertips, beginnings, middles and ends. You introduce a character in a situation, you develop it, you resolve it. Okay? In screenwriting parlance, that has been reduced to a kind of a cliche called three-act structure. And when people discover three-act structure, the beginning, the middle and the end, and the turning points involved as you move from the beginning to the middle and from the middle to the end, it often inspires them, and then it kind of kills their feeling about what they're doing. And absolutely, you must park that kind of knowledge when you're writing. I think you use it, that knowledge, the paradigm of the three acts, is something that you might bring to bear on your material at a certain point, but not to write as if you're filling in, a crossword puzzle. Turning points, rising action, climax, resolution, catharsis, all these are very basic principles of the dramatic art that it's good to study and to have at your fingertips, to look at the way in which film does that, by studying film, by reading screenplays, and by writing and rewriting, more than reading books. Books can come into the mix, but the real study should be of films and of screenplays. The core, and really the original screenwriting book, of course, and that many other screenwriting books are based on, and that I could recommend you look at if you haven't already, if you're studying screenwriting, is Aristotle's Poetics. And a lot of these American screenwriting books are really based on Aristotle's observations on Greek tragedy 2,500 years ago. And some of the key concepts that we still use today, like reversals and catharsis, come from his analysis of Greek tragedy. I think, though, it's interesting just to step back for a second. I think what Aristotle was doing when he was writing the Poetics, it was part of his larger philosophical scheme, which was to work out what the good life was, how we should live, what a good person was, and so on. And that by observing the drama, he was writing the Poetics also in argument with his teacher Plato, who had said that storytellers were liars and shouldn't be allowed into the Republic. He was claiming that there was a set of skills that storytellers had, and that people watching the story or the drama could acquire, that were essentially and very importantly human skills, skills of empathy, skills of identifying with the struggling human on the stage, that we felt pity for that human who had some undeserved misfortune, and we were moved by what happened to them, and we were frightened in case it happened to us, because of course it will happen to us, because we all know we're going to die, for example, and that's critical to the drama. That's critical to life and that movement between life and art. And this kind of thinking runs through the book. I mean, one of his key concepts, I think, is the notion of reversal. And you find this in all dramatic art, the sense of, and this is where surprise often comes as well as a principle, where something unexpected happens. And what we're watching then is how our protagonist deals with this unexpected happen chance, just as we might have to deal with an unexpected bad news or good news. Reversal is about the movement of the character from good fortune to bad fortune, or from bad fortune to good fortune. And the strongest plots accompany a movement within the character from ignorance to knowledge. They realize something at the end they didn't understand at the beginning. And so beginnings and ends are crucial and critical for Aristotle. The strongest plots, he argues, are where something that seemed insignificant at the beginning is the most important thing at the end. Aristotle emphasizes plot, actually, over character, and I'll come back to that in a second. For him, the unity of action, Achilles' anger in the Iliad, which leads to the death of his best friend, and the appalling treatment of Hector as his body is dragged around, and the consequence for the Greeks and for the Trojans. The through line, the arc of what Achilles does and doesn't do is what we're following. And it's the outcome of that that is uncertain, that is the crucial thing in the drama. This is why, Aristotle doesn't, he was writing 2,500 years ago, so he doesn't have the benefit of our psychological insight into character or psychology as a way of thinking about human beings. The Iliad and the Odyssey doesn't have characters that have really internal lives in the same way that Hollywood movie characters do, but in a way that modernist drama doesn't have, because it is skeptical about psychology, about the psychological construction of character that we find in mainstream Hollywood movies. The idea that we have motivations, we have objectives, that we know who we are, we know where we're going, and so on and so forth, is something that modernist cinema is very skeptical about. And the idea that we have a unitary self is very skeptical about. But we'll park that for a second. Aristotle's very much at the center of Hollywood, mainstream cinema, and mainstream television. The idea of everything being integrated through cause and effect, the idea that the beginning and end is related to each other, the unity of the action, all provide a powerful emotional experience for the audience. Someone like Brecht, for example, wanted to break that, because what this does is the empathetic connection between the audience and the struggling human in the drama is a kind of enchantment which Brecht wanted to break. So you will find both in theatre and in cinema a type of cinema that, like someone like Michael Haneke, has a much more objective relationship to his protagonists and his characters. He doesn't pretend that he knows their inner lives in the same way that a Hollywood movie does. You observe his characters in action rather than identify with them. So there are different ways of creating character and creating story. But Aristotle is central to the American style, because the American Hollywood form of cinematic narrative evolved very quickly out of the well-made play, which itself was based on rules established in the 16th century, which was a kind of reductive version of Aristotelian rules. So that stream runs right through Western culture, and right at the heart of mainstream drama. So understanding Aristotle gives you a real grip on what conventional classical storytelling is about and what it's like. When it comes to character, actually, let's make this point, that we are largely ignorant. We don't know who we are. We don't know who other people really are. And we don't have all the information, so we constantly get it wrong. Look at Brexit, for example, as a narrative. We're very limited, and we ricochet between our ignorance and our arrogance. And this is the very stuff of story. And that a lot of story and drama is about us working out the consequences of our mistakes, our mistaken assumptions about other people, our mistaken assumptions about ourselves, as well as the transgressive and primitive urges that disrupt our rational approach to life. We think we're reasonable, we know we're not. And the drama is very much about that, the eruption of erotic love, of jealousy, of our neediness. Aristotle is very strong on how vulnerable we are and how we have to conceal that, but how we need to reveal that if we're going to flourish as humans. And so you have the concept of the character arc, which is the way in which a character might develop through interaction with others, through being confronted with their vulnerability, with their secret, and having to deal with that. And by bringing it out into the open, changing, that's a central concept within the classical form, the idea of transformation through the character's interaction with the plot. There's a wonderful quote from the British psychoanalyst Winnicott. It's a joy to be hidden. It's a disaster not to be found. This goes to the heart of a lot of mainstream drama. The gradual revelation, under pressure, of an authentic self that has been hidden. It's absolutely central now to screenwriting books that a character has to have an objective. Right? They have to want something. And that want has to be frustrated. And through that frustration, you create the tension in the mind of the audience, but you also sustain the story. Because if the character gets what they want, story over, right? So character, objective, obstacle is that basic dynamic. David Mamet has turned that kind of model, that structural model from the character point of view, into 4 questions, 4 dramatic questions that you might want to note if you're a screenwriter and might have come across them. Who is your main character? You have to understand who they are, what their backstory is, what their background is. Secondly, what do they want or need? What are they after? What's their objective? Because that's what's going to drive the story. Why can't they get this? What's the obstacle to their desire? And finally, a kind of quite important question, what happens if they don't get this thing that they want? Because if there's nothing at stake for the character, there's nothing at stake for the audience, and there's no tension. If they could take or leave this thing that they're after, this lost object, this person, this place they're looking for, if it's neither here nor there, why should it be of any interest or importance to the audience? So that's an important question that's marbled into this central structural model around character that's in mainstream cinema, which is what's at stake for the character. You have to ask yourself. So these are questions that as you're evolving your story, you can apply to your material. So what's at the center of your story? Who is at the center of your story? What's driving the story? Because in classical filmmaking and in classical dramatic narrative, it's desire that's driving the story. It's character desire that's driving the story. And here we have this concept of character arc, which is sometimes sniffed at by more literary writers. I've noticed in the UK, it's like an American term, but it's very much part of the everyday parlance of script development and filmmaking. Character arc is simply that movement of the character from beginning to end, how they change through the interaction with the plot. It's the implication that all characters go on a journey, and that journey is both external and internal. So when you're thinking about your character, you're thinking about the external journey of the plot of Thelma and Louise getting away from the cops. But there's an internal journey that Thelma and Louise are going through, which is Thelma, the kind of child woman, is having to grow up. And Louise, who's rather uptight, needs to loosen up. And so they're going on different trajectories through the film. Internally, they're shape-shifting by degrees through the interaction with the incidents of the plot and the people they meet. They're changing. And we get to the end of the film, when they look at each other, we understand they've arrived at this point, and where it's inevitable that they have to go over that cliff. So the concept of journey relates to the character arc, the internal and external changes. And on this journey, the character is tested. That's what the obstacles are. You put more and more difficult obstacles in their way. And so they have to figure out how to get to where they're trying to get to in more ingenious ways, which is entertaining and interesting for the audience. This is the basic model. It requires in the character, therefore, conventionally, strength of will, tenacity, courage, and ingenuity, just like in a fairy tale. And in the book I talk about how fairy tales and the detective story are very good models for a lot of cinematic narratives. Desire is central to the classic form of filmmaking. Desire in our lives as well, driving us on, confusing us. We never know how things are going to turn out with characters in films or in our own lives. The characters are reflections of ourselves. Stories about character desire want, but sometimes need. I mean, a lot of stories are constructed quite simply around what a character wants is not what they need, or a character realizing what they want to be a gigolo in New York in the late 60s is not what they need to be loved. Midnight Cowboy. That's the simple through line. That's the simple reversal of Midnight Cowboy. And actually looking for simplicity, even in a complex piece like a feature-length film, is something you should constantly be looking forward to be able to reduce it to one line that embodies the dramatic problem, that embodies the dramatic energy at the center of your idea, to be constantly working for that. If you can't bring it down to 2 or 3 lines that really embody the dramatic narrative, then you're still searching for it. Characters are not static, but what you're writing in your dramas and in your screenplay, what you're writing and what you're working with your actors in your film, are characters in interaction with each other, in conflict with each other, and it's through the conflict they're exposed. They expose their values, they expose what they believe in, they expose their malevolence or their intentions. That's what the drama is. That's where the story energy comes from, that clash and contrast between different characters' desires. And the way film can photograph the internal lives of characters is a powerful idea, and it's something that as a screenwriter you need to integrate. The idea that the camera can photograph thoughts and feelings. If we know, for example, what a character values, if we know that this woman is the mother of that child, when that child runs into the road, we know exactly how she's feeling. So there are ways to access the inner lives of characters that are very powerful, powerful experience for the audience, which is something to be understood and studied by screenwriters. The camera is what you're writing for. It's the emotional and dramatic content of the scene rather than the dialogue that's important, the subtext. And the camera can explore action and movement and gesture and reaction. And often it's what is not said that's more important than what is actually said. The real feeling between the lines, and action and image and sound and the juxtaposition of these is what creates uniquely cinematic moments. And you can do that on the page. The book deals with short films because I think that is an arena in which you can learn a lot about screenwriting quite quickly. If you get to work on a short film, if you make a short film, if you write and direct a short film, it's something manageable. It's something that you can do quite cheaply as well. You can get together with friends. So the short is in itself a unique genre. But mainly, of course, the book is focusing on the feature film. And the feature film is like the sonnet or 12-bar blues. It's a very particular artistic and crafted form that can be studied and learned. I think, you don't have to read a book and you don't have to go to film school or do a screenwriting course to write a script or make films. But if you do, for most of us, we get better. If you do study, if you do collaborate, if you do have an exchange of ideas with other people, it's a very exciting way to develop as a human being and as an artist. It's not essential, but it's something very special to be enjoyed. And for most of us, it's a way of accelerating our growth and our development in our chosen craft. The short is usually best when it's a simple idea. You can often get as much emotional impact in a short film as you can in a feature. One scene comes from another. Everything has to be there for a good reason, a line of dialogue, an image. It's a very tightly 10 to 12 minutes. This is an account of a film in the book called Alumbramiento. It's a Spanish short film. This is from the book. The Spanish short film, and it embodies some of the things I've been talking about. The Spanish short film takes place late at night in the bedroom of an elderly woman who is dying. The conflict lies between the doctor's son desire to keep her alive, and his wife's recognition that it's time to help her die rather than to prolong her suffering. The film begins with a tiny flashing light in the dark that's revealed to be a mobile phone buzzing on a bedside table. A table lamp is switched on, illuminating a middle-aged man, Rafa, who sits on the edge of the bed, downcast and thoughtful. He replies to the call, "We're coming." Another bedside light is switched on. A woman, Sarah, sits up and asks, "How is she?" Now they're driving together through the night. Sarah looks concerned and scrutinises her husband's face. She reaches out and touches his hand. "What else can I do?" he says resignedly, then pulls his hand away. We are in a darkened apartment now. An old woman, Maria, lies in bed in obvious distress. A nurse reports that Maria has been restless and in a lot of pain. She's close to the end. But another woman, Rafa's sister, intervenes. "She will make it. She always does." Sarah looks troubled. Rafa expertly fills a syringe with morphine to calm her suffering. Sarah looks on, increasingly disturbed by what is happening. Time passes. Maria is waking up, but in a delirium, in real distress and panic, struggling to breathe, crying for her mother. Sarah suddenly steps forward and sits by the side of Maria's bed. She cradles Maria's head and strokes her hair, then gently tells Maria that she is going to die. We see the uncertain reactions of Rafa and his sister, but they seem to realise that Sarah is doing what they are unable to do. It is time. Sarah tells Maria to be calm, that she will not suffer any more. She eases the respirator from Maria's face and talks to her about her long life, her children, how they laughed at her jokes, and how she sang to them when they were frightened at night. Maria is calm now and drifting away, the hint of a smile on her face. Rafa is sitting on the other side of the bed and starts to sing quietly a children's lullaby that Maria may have sung to him as a child. That's it. Maria has stopped breathing. Sarah and Rafa look at each other. Sarah reaches out and puts her hand over Rafa's. This time, he does not take his hand away. Analysis. Sarah is the focus and protagonist of the story, but a relatively passive one, whose internal journey of concern for her husband, but more especially the suffering of her mother-in-law, finally breaks out into her intervention. The camera captures her thoughts, and through her eyes we gradually realise what is happening and what is at stake. The suffering of Maria and the doctor's son trying to prolong the life of his mother beyond reason. The tension caused by the rising concern of Sarah, the increasing distress of Maria, and the impotence of Rafa is released by Sarah's decision to intervene and ease Maria's passing. Other themes circulate: the medicalisation of death, the difficulty of letting go, and working out what the right thing is to do. The setup is delivered in short lines of dialogue that are also lines of action, pushing the story on. The dramatic questions that the audience will also seek answers to. How is she? What else can I do? The inciting incident is the phone call, and the move from Rafa and Sarah's house, the turning point that takes us into the middle of the film. The moment of final crises, when Maria is in extremis, turns the story to its climax. The structure of short films is often like this: a short, sharp setup, a long middle with a reversal, and a realization leading to a sudden end. And I'd just like to finish with a quote from a friend of mine, a very accomplished professional British screenwriter called Tony Grissoni. And he describes the process of screenwriting this way: when you write the film, you see in your mind You hear the music cues. You visualize the camera moves. Be playful. Be light on your feet. Pretend the characters can't speak. Write a silent movie without exposition. Tell the story in pictures. Thank you.